Vikram.
ଆଜ୍ଞା
Bikram, do
Yes,
you
ma'am.
want a tech check?
Yes, madam. Do
Yeah,
you
so
check,
you
madam?
can hear me clearly?
Welcome,
You
madam.
can hear me?
Welcome, madam, and you please check your slides, madam. Don't worry.
Okay, I am doing two things. So there is a slide which I'll now present, then I'll get out of it and I have a Chrome tab on which I'll present a film. So I'll quickly show you that.
Okay, okay, madam.
Can you see? Can you see my screen?
Yes,
Hello,
ma'am.
yes,
Bikram?
ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, ma'am. We can see your screen.
Thank you very much. So I'll get out of this. I'll stop the sharing. And I want to now check out the film. So give me a moment. Can you see this?
Yeah, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. We can see that.
Can you also hear it?
Yes.
Can you hear that?
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Shall you start now, ma'am? Payal, ma'am, is everything is ready? I'm audible.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. You are audible. We can start also. The time is also over.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Excellencies, honorable speakers, Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. We are celebrating the 50th round of glorious talk in Ranjit Guru Memorial Series of International Webinars. I, Mr. Rudranarayan Das, on behalf of the organizers, extend my heartfelt welcome to all. This symposium of Ranjit Guru Series of International Webinar is an initiative by the Department of History and Political Science, Jawaharlal Nehru College, Cuttack, in a close collaboration with Center for Adivasi Research and Development Studies, Odisha. I feel happy to express that we have successfully concluded the 48th round of panel discussion soon. In today's session, to enlighten us, we have three eminent speakers who have none other than Professor Indra Chaudhary, Professor Biswajit Das, and Professor Jatin Kumar Naik. It is our privilege. We are feeling privileged to host you all, sir and ma'am. The broad theme of our international conclave is kept as Initiative Policy Dialogue 2020, COVID-19, and Live Practice Beyond Pandemic. So, and now I would like to request Professor Sarat Chandra Pradhan, the convener of this webinar, to initiate his brief welcome address. Over to you, Professor Pradhan.
Thank you, Rudran, for inviting me for welcome address. Sarve bhavantu sukhino, sarve santu niramaya, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschit dukhava bhave. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Jai Jagannath. Namaste ko namaskar. Distinguished panelists, participants, and honorable guests, friends from the media, good morning and welcome to today's international discourses. Today, we are absolutely thrilled to announce that Ranjit Guru Memorial Series of International Conclave has successfully completed 50 sessions. We have heard some of the best academic activists, policymakers, journalists, judicial luminaries, and intellectual minds from across the globe. Belongs to a wide range of academic fields and domains, sharing their valuable insight on contemporary subjects to provide and unpack the complexities embedded in a post-pandemic world. We take this opportunity to extend our heartfelt gratitude to all the esteemed panelists who have wholeheartedly agreed to join this platform and share their experience, works, and ideas with young and aspiring minds. We truly and generously value their time and support that we have received unconditionally. We are also equally grateful to our participants who have turned out in large numbers despite issues of connectivity and digital divide. We want to recognize their hunger for knowledge and to learn from scholars of national and international repute. Last but not the least, we would like to thank our logistics team and the Department of History and Political Science at the Jawaharlal College, Cuttack, for making these platforms and taking the lead in hosting this event with the close association with CARD. This whole initiative has been a brainchild of Dr. Vikram Kesari Jana, Director, Center for Adivasi Research Development, who truly believes in dreaming big, and he wanted to ensure that students from small villages coming from interior and rural areas of Odisha get to hear some of the most influential minds. Rightly mentioned by our mentor. If you platform areas, engage yourself in read, write, speak, and listen. The art of avoid all problems, this pandemic also not impacting us due to the greatly enhance our knowledge to conducting the marathon webinar series. And he is assured that this whole exercise will help the young minds to aspire and dream big. This has been the sole purposes behind initiating this event. Once again, we thank each and every stakeholders of this platform for their support, motivation, and encouragement, without which we would not have been able to reach more than 50 sessions. Thank you. Today, for celebrating world records, highest virtual talks in a site platform with a single platform with a have witnessed for all the mother of oral history, Professor Indra Chaudhary, founding director, Center for Public History, Srishti Art, Designs and Technology, Bangalore. Professor Biswajit Das, founder director of Center for Culture, Media and Governance, Jamia Millia University, New Delhi, of a great communication scholars of a global repute. And finally, the man behind this webinar, none other than Professor Jatindra Kumar Naik, Professor of English Literature and Language, the great translator as well as the founder of Shiksha Sandhana at Bhubaneswar. Besides all, they are close friends and teachers and mentor of our young director of this small institution, Center for Adivasi Research and Development, Odisha. Finally, we got an information all three eminents are key advisor of CARD for promoting emerald research and policy for social changes among tribal communities to shape their nature, culture, language, and identity. Then you all to join with us for celebrating our success. Sarat Pradhan, Department of History, Jawaharlal College, Pampara.
Thank you, Professor Pradhan. Now, I would like to request Ms. Payal Agarwal, our co-coordinator, to carry on the session with a guest introduction. Over to you, Ms. Agarwal.
Thanks, Rudra sir, for giving me the honor to introduce our esteemed guest for today's lecture series. Now, first of all, warm greetings to one and all. Today it is really a memorable day for all of us. We are celebrating Rashtriya Ekta Divas, paying homage to Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel on his birth anniversary, and also the Ranjit Guru Memorial series of international webinars will successfully complete the 50th round of lecture today. So on this note, I would like to invite our first distinguished guest speaker, Professor Indra Chaudhary. She is the founder director of the Center for Public History, Srishti Institute of Art, Design and Technology, Bangalore, India. She is a former professor of English at Jadavpur University, Kolkata. She is also the founder of Archival Resources for Contemporary History, Bangalore. Her most noted work, The Frail Hero and Virile History, won the Tagore Prize in 2001. She was also awarded the New India Fellowship to work on the manuscript of her book titled Growing the Tree of Science, Homi Bhabha, and the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research. Apart from this, she has translated novels from Bengali to English, has compiled the supplement of Indian English words in the Oxford Advanced Learners Dictionary. She is also the founding member of Oral History Association of India. Ma'am, your achievement seems to be unending. I welcome you for today's session. Your topic, as suggested by you, is Real and Imaginary Journeys, Partition and Memory Communities. Next esteemed guest speaker is Professor Biswajit Das. He is the professor and founding director of Center for Culture, Media and Governance, Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi, India. He has almost 3 decades of teaching and research experience in the field of history, in the field of theory, method and history of communication in India. He has been a visiting professor at York University, Toronto, and fellow at the University of Windsor, Canada, East West Center, Hawaii, MSH Paris, and the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla. Besides his teaching and research career, he has involved with various civil society initiatives in the country in media advocacy program and development communication projects. Besides these, he is also the co-editor of the SAGE series on communication process, of which the first volume, Media and Mediation, was published in 2005, and the second, The Social and the Symbolic, in 2007, the third volume on Culture and Confrontation in 2010. Sir, thanks a lot for connecting with us. Sir will put his insights on Gandhian thought and communication. Now, last but not the least, the esteemed and distinguished speaker is Professor Jatindra Kumar Nayak, a visiting professor of Relevance University in the Department of English, Cuttack, and a retired professor, Utkal University, Odisha, is an Indian translator, literary critic, columnist, editor, and academic from Odisha. He has translated several works of Odia literature into English, some of which includes Yantra Ruddha, a novel by Chandrasekhar Rath as Astride the Wheel, for which he has received the 2004 Hutch Crosswood Book Award for Indian Language Fiction Translation. He also won the Katha Translation Award for his English rendering of Tarunakanti Mishra's short story as The Descent. He is also a co-translator of the English translation of Odia novel Chhaman Athaguntha by Fakir Mohan Senapati. The English translation of the book was first published in US under the title 6 Acres and a Third. He has also translated into English the Atma Jibana Charita, the autobiography of Fakir Mohan Senapati as Story of My Life. His other notable translations in English include the translation of Jagannath Prasad Das, Desa Kala Patra into a Time Elsewhere. He also founded an organization, Rupantar, in Bhubaneswar, which publishes translation of Odia books in English. Sir, thanks a lot for connecting with us. Sir, your topic as suggested by you is Knowledge Society 3.0. Now, on this special occasion, we have again invited Dr. Priyadarshi Kara, Department of History, Relevance University, Cuttack, who is a dedicated and committed teacher, to address a keynote talk on this very occasion. So, first of all, I would like to invite Dr. Priyadarshi Kara. Over to Dr. Kara.
Hello. Good morning, everybody. Am I audible? Payal?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir, you are audible. Yes, sir, you are audible.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this wonderful webinar series. We have such wonderful distinguished guests today on our panel that we don't have time to discuss anything else. We are eager to listen to them. Professor Indra Chaudhary is a known academic and activist, and on the Center for Public History is known in the country and worldwide, and we're eager to listen to her. And Professor Biswajit Das and Professor Jatin Naik in Odisha basically, and when in the country and elsewhere outside, they don't need any introduction. So without wasting any time, I have been asked to moderate this session. And without getting into any keynote address, I will request Professor Indra Chaudhary to begin her talk. And the procedure is like that. Professor Chaudhary and his distinguished speaker will get around 40-45 minutes to speak. This speech will be followed by a 10 or 15 minutes on a question answer session. And then we will continue. That is the order: Professor Chaudhary, Professor Das, Professor Naik. And I'm looking forward to a very interesting, very enriching session today. And I'm delighted to be here. And without, so I would request all participants to mute their audio video when the speaker is speaking. We'll only listen to the speaker. And request all participants to put their questions in the chat box. After 10 or 15 minutes, the speech takes over. So with this, I would congratulate the organizers and organizer of CARD, Dr. Jena and entire team, Dr. Pradhan, and the entire college authorities of Jawaharlal Nehru College to begin the session. Happy Kumar Purnima, and I wish we'll have a very wonderful session in the coming couple of hours. Thank you so much. I now invite Professor Indra Chaudhary to address the gathering. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Kar. And I must begin by thanking Dr. Bikram Kishori Jena, who's the director of CRD, because I consider him one of my eminent students who came and studied with us and did oral history. I'd also like to thank the principal of Jawaharlal Nehru College for organizing this series, and of course, Professor Jatin Naik of Utkal University for suggesting that I speak in this forum. So thank you for this, and I'll now begin my presentation. Just 1 minute. I have titled my talk, Real and Imaginary Journeys, Partition and Memory Communities. And I will soon explain what I mean by memory communities, what I mean by these journeys. I shall focus on the partition of India of 1947 and memory and the processes of meaning making that oral history interviews alert us to. Our present situation, where all that we were familiar with in other circumstances, I would have been there in Cuttack and talking to all of you. But the present COVID-19 situation has made everything we do everything remotely, and this whole process has become almost unrecognizable. And perhaps this is what puts us in a better position to understand the kind of role memory played in anchoring communities that are displaced, forced to relocate and rebuild their homes and identities in places that were once distant and familiar. In this photograph, we see Mahatma Gandhi along with Abdul Khan Ghaffar Khan, the gentle Pashtun freedom fighter, often called Frontier Gandhi, walking through Jahanabad in Bihar in March 1947. 5 months before the partition of India. Riots had devastated Jahanabad. The photograph is iconic, but it's also ominous. The context of the photograph seems to augur what would follow, the riot and bloodshed that followed the partition of India, and actually also preceded it. This photograph also raises an interesting question about the journey of a nation to create citizens, and hints at the journeys that the displaced were beginning to embark on at this point. The history textbooks of independent India would speak only about one of these journeys, and for decades silence the other. Those of us who were born in independent India would be continuously reminded of Nehru's famous speech as he inaugurated a new nation. And here is a photograph of Nehru making his famous Tryst with Destiny speech. Gandhi, who you see to your right, of course, was absent from these celebrations. He was fasting in Calcutta, and communal violence, as we know, had erupted in Calcutta almost a year prior to Indian independence. And this violence continued long after the partition was implemented on 17th August 1947. Gandhi was also fasting that day, as he felt most of the peasants in India did not have the resources to celebrate. In this photograph, he is covering his ears to shut out the voices from outside, where an angry mob had gathered. The Radcliffe Line, which demarcated the boundary between India and Pakistan, was published on 17th August 1947. The line was named after Sir Cyril Radcliffe, chairman of the two boundary commissions, one in the east in Bengal and the other in the west in Punjab. Radcliffe was in charge of dividing the territory and 88 million people. The task had to be completed within 5 weeks of his arrival in India on 8 July 1947. And I have here what I think many of you will recognize as a poem, a poet who all of us study when we do English literature. But this is Odin's poem about the partition of India, written in 1966. Unbiased, at least he was when he arrived on his mission. Having never set eyes on this land, he was called to partition. Between two peoples, fanatically at odds with their different diets and incompatible gods, time they had briefed him in London is short. It's too late for mutual reconciliation or rational debate. The only solution now lies in separation. Shut up in a lonely mansion with police night and day, patrolling the gardens to keep assassins away, he got down to work to the task of settling the fate of millions. The maps at his disposal were out of date, and the census returns almost certainly incorrect, but there was no time to check them, no time to inspect contested areas. The weather was frightfully hot, and a bout of dysentery kept him constantly on the trot. But in 7 weeks it was done. The frontiers decided, a continent for better or worse divided. The next day he sailed for England, where he quickly forgot the case as a good lawyer must. Return he would not, afraid, as he told his club, that he might get shot. And the Partition Museum, which is now opened a couple of years ago in Amritsar, has actually one of our former ambassadors talk about his meeting with Sir Cyril Radcliffe, who, according to him, did regret this action, but he was asked to do this. So I want to focus on what happened, because with the establishment of the line that bears Sir Cyril Radcliffe's name, the British had created, what Urvashi Butalia, one of the first scholars to write on partition, has called one of the great human convulsions of history. In her words, never before or since have so many exchanged their homes and countries so quickly. The coming of independence on 15th August 1947 brought with it the creation of Pakistan, and 12 million people became refugees, moving between India and East and West Pakistan. This forced migration of the Hindu, Muslim, and Sikh communities was accompanied by slaughter and violence. Contemporary British estimate of the dead was 200,000, but it is now accepted that 1 million people died in the riots or of starvation and disease. About 75,000 women were abducted and raped, and thousands of families divided. For the generation that witnessed partition, either because they experienced partition themselves or saw the refugees pouring into their cities, the partition was a reality to be lived with. And the refugee experience, of course, the history that was taught to my generation at school ended with Nehru's Tryst with Destiny speech. It ended with Indian independence, the glorious independence. And then we learned civics. We did not learn about the refugee experience. And this experience was just not included in those early textbooks. It was only in 1998 when pioneers like Urvashi Butalia, Ritu Menon, Kamla Bhashin began to publish oral histories about people's experiences during partition that you had an attempt to include some of this in some textbooks, which are right now not available. Since then, there have been studies of partitions and using oral history to understand partition, both in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And in this talk, I'll be focusing mainly on displaced communities in India. But I've included here Anand Zakaria's book, which looks at how partition was played itself out in Pakistan, or the book in the middle called The Bengal Diaspora looks at the Muslim population that went from Bengal to East Pakistan at that point. When Urvashi Butalia began to work on partition, her own family was affected by this. She says that she began to realize that partition was not just a political divide or a division of property or assets or liabilities. It was often also what survivors called it, a division of hearts. It brought untold suffering, tragedy, trauma, pain, and violence to communities who had hitherto lived together in some kind of social contract. It separated families across an arbitrarily drawn border, sometimes overnight, and made it practically impossible for people to know if their parents, sisters, brothers, or children were alive or dead. I'm going to now stop presenting and, and show you a film that, is made by the designer Nina Sabnani. And I'll show that on Chrome tab because that is the only way you'll get to hear it. It's a simple film. It is, again, based on her interviews with her father about the partition.
Mukund and Riaz were the best of friends, although they would occasionally play together. Riaz loved Mukund's cap and tried hard to get at it. This cricket cap was Mukund's prized possession. With a cap on, he felt he could do anything. Well, just about. Riaz took Mukund to a traditional bone setter who lived in the Kyamari area. For his fees, he asked for the good wishes of those who got cured. If they wished him well, that kept his talent alive. However, if Mukund was very keen to pay, he could slip something into the box quietly. loved cricket and tried hard to get Riaz to play with them. But Riaz's interests lay elsewhere. Suddenly, a military van pulled up on Campbell Street and a soldier ordered them to stop playing and go home at once. Riaz said it was best to keep out of trouble and to move off. Their spirits picked up with the smell of the bakery. And it didn't take much time to enjoy the best things life could offer. Mukund's was a large family, and each one took on some responsibility. Mukund often sat in front of the Gurudwara on Campbell Street and looked after people's shoes. Near the Gurudwara was the famous Ladaram Faluda Wala. Mukund was always fascinated by his multicolored concoctions. Ladaram was fond of the boy and told Mukund that if he served iced water to the devotees, it would earn him some blessings. Ladaram took it upon himself to supply the iced water. In this way, they were both stocking up some merit points for the future. At the end of the day, Ladaram would give Mukund the bucket of water that he took home to his family. When Mukund could get a moment alone with the mirror, his precious cricket cap brought on visions of his future. Then came the day Mukund would not talk about for 60 years of his life. It began like any other day at the S.C. Sahani High School, except that the teacher was missing. So everyone did what they pleased. Riaz came in and whispered. It did not make any sense. On the street, nothing looked the same, and Mukund could not recognize anyone. At home, Mukund's father said they had to leave. It was Riaz knocking at the door, and he had brought kurtas and jinnah caps to help them disguise themselves. Mukund refused to remove his cap. Riaz drove them to the Karachi harbour. Their gratitude had no words. They did not know what to say. Mukund looked at Riaz, and then he remembered. Mukund and Riaz never met again. But But to this day, Mukund remembers him waving at him from the shore that was once home. Waving, waving for an eternity.
Well, after that film, which was so moving, it's very difficult to get back, but let me take you back to my presentation, which tries to make the point in a different way through text. So I want to move here about the way partition separated families. And one such family is the family of Shunanda Shikdar, whose Bengali book is called Doyamoyir Kotha. And she talks about how she doesn't really come to India till much, much later. She comes to India when, in 1961. So she witnesses all the her neighbors leaving. And what is ironical here, she recounts that the neighbors would weep and leave and say, Buri, we are leaving. We are unlikely to ever meet anyone from here ever again. Do look us up when you too are in Hindustan. And then she says, well, we did reach Hindustan finally, but we never again met any of them. We didn't know then that Hindustan was such a huge place, and it was impossible to find anyone there. So I think what is quite interesting is that from this little village, once they come to Hindustan, they can't really have that same connection again. When the time comes for her to finally leave with her foster mother, who is really her aunt, but she was brought up by her aunt, she says, as they were leaving, her foster mother was really upset. And she looks at her face that day and promises herself that I'd never again speak of home, of Desh, our land. Ma and I never spoke of Desh again with each other. This is one promise I was able to keep. Until the day Ma died, I didn't say a word about home, about Desh, our land. What is interesting is that Doyamai refers to her homeland as Desh, not to the nation state, but to Desh, which evokes an intimate connection to the land. Because Desh is a place, as we know, both in Bengali and in Odia, it is a place which with which one shares a cultural bond. And it holds together the land of one's birth and the land of one's growing up. It is also the land of one's ancestors, the place to which one belongs culturally. And therefore it is Desh that evokes nostalgia. And this idea of Desh contrasts sharply with the history that the nation state envisions. The imagined community, which Anderson had argued joins people into a historically constituted community, constructs its history with an eye to the future, with a vision for the future. But for the displaced, Desh only has a past. It does not exist in the present, nor does it have a future. Most of them can never return, and even when they return, they don't see their Desh. And this is, therefore one finds that even though history books wanted us to be celebratory, a lot of people in that period were not celebrating freedom. And the filmmaker Ritik Kumar Ghatak was one of them. He was born in Dhaka in 1925, and he saw that independence of India came at a price. and he was unwilling to celebrate that independence. Almost all his films focus on the partition and its aftermath. And in his films, the refugee can never find a foothold, this new nation state. And there were reasons for this. If we look at some of the scholarship around partition, we find that people have documented what actually creates a problem, particularly in Bengal, where, as Haimanti Roy, who writes Partitioned Lives, Migrants, Refugees, Citizens in India, says that, Bengali Hindus were routinely identified as within public forums as migrants who suffered from a psychological problem and fear of violence, because it was widely propagated that they didn't suffer violence in the way people from the West Pakistan border did. She also points out that the Indian state wanted people to first embrace the identity of refugee, which is, not always someone who has that dignity. They don't want it, but they have to embrace that identity before they can be given Indian citizenship. And of course, the other thing that keeps coming up again and again, and in my oral history interviews with people from both sides of the border, that, there is a privileging of the freedom fighter. And the refugee is not really someone who's given something, but not really the privileges. And this is Kamala Mankekar, one of the first women journalists in India. And when I interviewed her, she says, both sides, Hindus were butchered, so were Muslims. But people didn't talk about this because the government did not encourage that. But she says it was also the migrant attitude. I won't call them refugees. They were migrants. They did not beg, borrow, or seek charity. No, they were too proud of people, and they tried to re-establish themselves. And she says, particularly leaders began to think that the luxuries and resources of the country should be at their beck and call because they were the freedom fighters. But she says, what about the millions who had lost everything? They came like paupers. Were they not freedom fighters? Perhaps their sacrifices were far more than these so-called freedom fighters. And what did they get? I want to now turn to a bit of family history to say how, to make a point about how divided families functioned and what these geographies of memory evoked all the time. I grew up in a small town called Burnpur, which is in the industrial belt in Bengal. And my father's side of the family had worked in different parts of India from 1930s onwards. After partition, my great-grandfather, his sister, and my great-grandmother had opted to stay on in Kumilla. And I've shown you the map. And it was, one of the largest cities in what became East Pakistan. And my great-grandfather remained part of our lives as the family visited him whenever they could. And this photograph, which I turn to next, is taken on the occasion of my parents' visit to meet them in 1954 after they had got married. And I think some of the people who I see here as very young boys are in fact today present, my uncles present at this lecture. So I'm very, very honored by that. So this is my great-grandfather's house. And, this became something that they did. And I'll show you later one of the last photographs taken in that house in 1964, just before the war. Now this, to deal with this problem of divided families, there was a joint India-Pakistan passport that was issued to people who wanted to visit family, friends, or ancestral homes on the other side of the Radcliffe line. And this passport came into force in 1952. And I was lucky to find my father's passport, which declares him to be a citizen of India. And actually, it's also my first passport because this was created at a time when we visited my great-grandfather in 1961. But here is the thing, the small industrial town I grew up in, which was set up by Martin Byrne, was called Burnpur. Most members of my extended family also moved there, where my grandfather, who you see to the right, was a doctor and he worked in the hospital there. Our lives revolved around the factory and its timings. Work at home, meal times were organized around the factory sirens that indicated the change in work shifts. As children, we thought this was where we belonged, and we were very puzzled about the talk about Desh, a homeland that was across the border. We lived in an industrial town, and by contrast, the landscape of Desh that was invoked was rural and semi-urban. My father and his siblings spoke about the fish, varieties that we had never seen on this side of the border, and about rivers and boat rides that were not part of our everyday lives. But the family found other ways to keep alive memories of the village and the town they came from. The village they came from was not far from Merkutta, and it was called, it was not far from Kumilla, it was called Merkutta, and it's now called Nobinagar. It was on the banks of the Titash. No one, not even the extended family, visited it again. And there exists no photographs of this village home in the family albums. What exists are photographs from Kumilla, which is my grandmother's father's house. But the memories of that village and its ways were kept alive through stories and evoked in what you're seeing now, my aunt's photo album. This first page honors her great-grandparents, who are right at the center, as you can see, and they're surrounded by photographs of public figures. So you have Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, who, by the way, was born in Cuttack and attended Ravenshaw College for a while, and of course, Jawaharlal Nehru, Chittaranjan Das, but it also has Sharat Chandra Chattopadhyay and Rabindranath Tagore and Ramakrishna Paramhamsa, the 19th century mystic saint, and the faded photographs of landscapes that she probably could never return to. And this page perhaps is symbolic of all that she valued and honored as her ancestors, those who belonged to the family and those who belonged to the land. There were also other ways in which Desh was recreated in the house that my grandfather lived in. It was always referred to as Basha. Basha translates into English as nest, but this signifies something temporary because their real home or their Desher Bari was Kumilla or Merkutta. It was not Burnpur. Some of the rituals that our family participated in needed certain types of leaves, certain roots, and certain herbs. The leaves of the jackfruit tree were needed for one such, and the jackfruit tree was planted and nurtured till it grew strong and supplied not just the leaves, but also the fruit in the summer. Turmeric, taro, small figs were always needed for rituals, and these roots and trees were planted and nurtured. The family had a cow and banana trees, but most of all, the recreation of Desh was done through stories that turned away from the narratives that the state constructed and expected new citizens to embrace. And this is a very, very important point. These citizens lived somewhere else. This was the journey of memory that they undertook in their memory all the time. This is not just my finding, but a lot of partition scholars, including a very young scholar called Devarati Chakravarti, who in her interviews with refugees from East Pakistan who settled in Calcutta, talks about similar nostalgic yearning for Desh, the homeland. She recounts how some of her interviewees had, at one point after partition, decided to quit India, echoing Gandhi's Quit India movement, because they felt that they'd rather return to their small town or village in East Pakistan, where they had grown up, because after all, this was not the India they had imagined. However, Unable to return, or even after they returned to settle there permanently, they recreated their homeland through organizations or clubs where stories about that place, the Desh that they had left behind, could be kept alive with its cuisine and culture discussed all the time. And she says throughout the resettlements, these displaced people continuously remembered, compared, contrasted, and mourned that place which they had left behind. After all, it was a place which is more often than not, they refer to this place as Deshebari. They had to flee. The place they had to flee gave them an established sense of their own self and identity. And that place is where they lived, and that they were well settled in their homes, and now they had to leave that. This milieu and the people situated in that time and place, they're remembered here and now. And that is an important point. So when they talk about Bodishal, Shomiti, and all these places actually recreate all those places left behind earlier. Returning to family history, this is the photograph I referred to earlier in 1964. This is one of the last photographs taken at my great-grandfather's home. And you can see here, this little girl is my cousin, and her mother, who's right behind her, is someone I had the privilege to interview. And I will refer to that in a bit. It was a very strange beginning, this interview, because most of us as oral historians begin by asking, when and where were you born? And this is what she told me. 30th July was my birthday, but from 1966, it became the day my father died. We had planned that we would go and be with him when the time came, but after the war of 1965, we couldn't go. Even communication lines were often closed. And she says later, our relatives sold portions of the house, did not give any money to our mother. In a few months, she could not manage there and was living in great poverty. We brought her to India through one of the borders in North 24 Parganas in West Bengal. Now, this is the grandmother, the great-grandmother I have seen. And till I did this interview with my great aunt, I did not really know her story. Around the time she was quite old, and a few months before she passed away, I was in their house and not feeling particularly well. And she kept telling me that since you have nobody to call your own in this place, maybe, when he comes back, that is her husband, who was by then gone, I will send you to your house in the ghodagari, that will come, in the coach that will come. And I thought this was quite ridiculous, like she was just saying something, till I realized that she no longer lived in the place she was brought to. She no longer lived in Calcutta. In her mind, she lived in her house in Kumila. And this was really very, very tragic. And none of us really were able to recognize that, because we grew up trying to embrace a very different history. So her history, I must say, I revisited only much more recently. So I wanted to also say that, when we think of Desh is revisited through stories, but Desh is also revisited through practices, especially through artisanal work and work done with one's hands. The creation of products of Kantha embroidered cloth is, these products it's a new phenomenon in India and Bangladesh, because it began more than a decade after the creation of Bangladesh in 1971. Kantha embroidery was usually done at home, and objects were created for household consumption. New products such as scarves, stoles, bedspreads were made for commercial consumption by craft NGOs on both sides of the border. And we see this in Calcutta after the making of Bangladesh. And this is, again, a photograph of refugees coming in after the making of Bangladesh. So Shumita Bishwas, who now makes a living from creating kantha embroidered cloth, was born in India of refugee parents in Ghutiari Sharif in West Bengal. And her parents had settled there after partition. She is now a resident of one of the suburbs of Kolkata, and she recalls stories of kantha embroidery in villages of what is now Bangladesh. Shumita speaks of the history of her craft, linking it to districts that are now in Bangladesh. And since she was born on this side of the border, I'm surprised by the familiarity with which she recounts this history along with place names. Shumita's quote unquote recollection of how this craft was practiced in villages of what is now Bangladesh alerts us to the replication of memory and nostalgia that is not her own. These stories, which she recounts, belongs to the oral culture of nostalgia that her parents and her larger extended family participate in. Indeed, it is not unusual for Bengalis who are on the Indian side to identify with villages and localities that the previous generation had left behind. As Bashobi Fraser put it in her introduction to Bengal Partition Stories, an unclosed chapter, whenever a Bengali from erstwhile East Bengal, later East Pakistan, and now Bangladesh meets another Bengali, she or he always asks in the course of the introductory preliminaries, "Where are you from?" The palimpsest reading of such a question would be deciphered as, "Are you from East Bengal? Which district?" Endless repetition about the village left behind brings alive for Shumita's generation a rural life that she, by virtue of living so close to Kolkata, cannot hope to possess. Shumita consolidates the family memory as she speaks about the craft she now practices in another place, indeed in another country, and in another time, and in a completely different context. It is the existence of this kind of memory community that makes it possible for her to recall what is lost. And we began, and this is, again, Shumita's group, the Ponchannogram Mohila Shomiti, which is making a huge katha together. And you begin to see all of them. I mean, they are second generation refugee children, and they all have these stories. We began with Jawaharlal Nehru's inaugural speech. Independent India had to redeem its pledge as it awoke to life and freedom. This moment also signaled the freedom to choose the past that would hold the new nation together. That past, I'm arguing, was a contentious one, and within 2 decades, the rough terrain was evened out and indeed refitted with a history that ended with the emergence of the Indian state. By the late 1960s, 2 decades after independence, the state began to actively foster sites of memory with statues of freedom fighters. After Mahatma Gandhi's assassination on 30th January 1948, nearly every city renamed one of its major streets after him, not to mention the innumerable statues that were now used to replace colonial statuary. This could perhaps be seen as the state's attempt to create an imagined community. It was not something that the refugees could relate to. For those displaced, the question remained, was this the new India that the freedom movement had promised? Most refugees who had lost their cherished homeland and entered this new nation in a state of being uprooted, in Bengali the word for refugee is udbastu, or the one who has been uprooted from his or her home or bastu. They found the story of freedom promoted by the state very hard to make their own. As refugees rebuilt their lives, they found that the only way the new boundaries drawn by the state could be transgressed was through memory. By recollecting a life elsewhere, where they had land, a home, and work that could keep body and soul together. Of course, these accounts were often sentimental and laced with nostalgia. They were also, in a sense, not real, but attempts to make sense of the past and give it a place in the present within which they were now ensconced. The boundary between past and present was often blurred in such recollections. Nostalgia, memories of another place, were not merely sentimental. There were ways of, and I will repeat this, active unbelonging, because they challenged the heroic and nationalist stories of the state. While many within the refugee community nurtured deep hatred for the other community, in their nostalgic reconstruction, they created a space where friendships and mutual dependence seemed possible. Harking back to another time and place expresses perhaps that unwillingness to insert oneself into the history of independent India. It was a means, perhaps the only means, by which those who experienced partition could hold on to a past that would never become history. The act of participating in a memory community is a way of possessing the lost past, of holding on to a sense of place without any territorial claims, and indicating a form of passive resistance to the agendas of the state, reminding us that memories shape human beings more than state agendas have ever cared to acknowledge. Perhaps this understanding can help us, oral historians, create new directions for our craft and demonstrate how we could use it for better understanding of forced migration, especially now when new lines are being drawn to define and dispossess quote-unquote refugees. It is oral history and its deep engagement with memory that can enable us to understand the past and the role it plays in the present, and push us to imagine new futures that might be possible for refugees where they are not defined by dispossession, deprivation, and distress, but by the stories that they carry with them and within them. With that, I'll end, and I'd like to thank a number of people in my family who are no more, who had shared stories with me. Some members of my family who I know are here listening, thanks to you that I know so much of these stories. I'd like to thank Shumita Vishwas. I'd like to thank the CSSC archive. I'd like to thank Debaruti and my students who do PhD with me and have always, listened with great patience. And with that, I think I will end my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Indra ma'am, for your excellent presentation. As the moderator for today's session, I would like to invite Dr. Priyadarshi Kaur to please moderate the session for today.
Yeah, thank you, Payal. I have no words to comment on Professor Chaudhary's stimulating presentation. What a presentation, ma'am. When being a student of history, I got to revisit partition and history of partition in a very different manner. Yes, it is true that oral history is being increasingly considered as a wonderful way of revisiting our past, and to look at our past in multiple ways, and to redefine this or the notion of nation state, and to even the notion of citizenship. And when you talked about memory being a mechanism of reconstituting citizenship, reconstituting human identity, these are really new ways of looking at history, and new ways of enriching the textual history that we have been fed up, that we have been fed with. And I will take up some questions within 10 minutes or so. There are some questions, but I would ask I'll begin with my question, madam, if you permit me. That you talked about that reconstructing the history, or the ways the people revisit their past. The people who are called refugees are actually migrants, or these people who carry a lot of pain and suffering and agony in them. And when they reflect upon that, on the basis of their memory, you interview them, you draw lessons from them, then you compare these memories, these interviews, the output of these interviews with the written text or the written materials which are available, or other written archival sources and all. Then you construct a balanced picture. But my question to you is, ma'am, how far we can trust human memory as a human memory as a tool, or as an basis of this authentic reconstruction. I'm sure. I mean, why I'm saying this, because Sudhir Kakar, when you read Sudhir Kakar, who witnessed partition as a small child, and when he writes in Colors of Violence about partition memories and all that, I get this idea from Sudhir Kakar, the renowned psychoanalyst, when he says one thing, that when you read their autobiographies, or when you try to look at the way they talk, there's a problem with that. And he says that many times people, their autobiographies, or the kind of writings they do, or the kind of things they say, that many times there are two urges fighting in the mind of the interviewee, and that is the urge to be authentic and the urge to be read. So when you read at these autobiographies, or these self articulations, you find that two urges are fighting in between the human being whom you are interviewing. One, the urges to be authentic, that I'll write or I'll say whatever is authentic. And there is another urge which is also equally tussling against this urge to be authentic, is the urge to be read, to be heard, to be believed. So when there is a conflict between these two, Kakar says, many often the urge to be authentic is dominated by the urge to be read and heard and believed. If this kind of a contradiction exists, how trustful, how useful are these interviews, or these versions of these refugees, or quote unquote, or migrants, in terms of reconstituting our history? And I have no doubt that this is a wonderful way of doing history, and alternative ways of recapturing the pluralities of experiences and all that. But how do you look at memory and the experiences of these people who suffered real time agonies and sufferings of partition? How do you, as an oral historian, as a partition scholar, how do you look at people's memory as a tool, or as a basis of reconstructing the partition past, partition reality? Ma'am, would you kindly unmute yourself and speak?
Sorry. Thank you for that question, Professor Kar. That is really a very, very important question, and one that from the 90s onwards, oral historians have tried to, answer in very satisfactorily. It's just that oral historians are not studied in India. Oral historians are not given that space. So let me tell you what we look for. When we do oral histories, we don't really try to understand facts. The facts come sometimes from documents, sometimes from other visual, resources. In oral history, as the oral historian Alessandro Portelli has told us, we are looking at what does something mean to the person who's talking to us. The person has gone through something and is explaining to you what does that experience mean to him or her. So it is about meaning making. That is the process. That's why you'd see a lot of oral historians come from the background of literature. They come from, they have different ways of understanding the speech. It is, true, while Kakar is, talking about psychoanalysis, many of us are not looking at, this kind of conflict. We are looking at why is it that this person is making meaning, why does the partition mean this to this person? Okay. But the other thing that we often put as a question to historians, and my oral historian friends in Czechoslovakia often bring this up, that look at our archives. The archives that we have in the Czech Republic now, which were created during the Soviet regime, many of those meetings did not take place. We have written documentation of those meetings. When we talk to people, they tell us, oh, this didn't happen. So, it is not as if you can really trust the colonial archives with authenticity or truth. And I'm sorry, but I think I'm also trained in history. But I think this is a point many of us miss, that we look at colonial archives and we start creating our history and we say, oh, memory is unreliable. There are two ways in which we also look at that. That when we say unreliable memory, yes, sometimes, I've interviewed people who have dementia at this point. But there, the challenge is for me, why did I wait till that person became so old, has dementia, to go and talk to that person? Why didn't I respect that person's memory or that person's experience much before this? And I think we haven't. We've missed a whole generation and not done interviews with them. How we interpret that is a later question, but not even to have records, I think that is a flaw in the way we have treated our past. But thank you for that question, because it let me tell you a lot more.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Can I
Please, sir. Please, sir. Please, sir.
Well, I must congratulate Professor Indra Chaudhary for such a wonderful lecture. Brilliant. It was so moving. I have some experience of working on two issues. One is on memory. The other one is on partition. I have finished two papers, in fact, which will be shortly published. As regard memory, I worked on television and memory. It's mostly an anthropological work looking at, can television have a memory? So it's a very conflicting kind of notions of memories, what we talked about memory today. The second one is about, you talked about partition. I have gone through the literature on partition studies. This was a great information for me about partition in Bengal side, but mostly because I'm based in Delhi, so we normally happen to look at Punjab partition and so on. One aspect which was neglected in the entire understanding about partition and memory, and also the way the historians engage with partition studies. Mostly their source of informations are mostly looking at press, newspaper reportings. Like you also showed some of the pictures from the newspaper. Now, how a historian engages with partition, for instance, they can squeeze 60 years, 40 years down the line, 20 years. For them, a journalistic reporting, because you see every day is a phenomenon. So what we sort of try to look at is actually the speech, what you mentioned. We analyze the rhetorics and the speech. And this is where we have taken Dawn and National Herald and sort of trying to make a comparison and trying to understand through the speech articulated through the politicians and during the partition, and also trying to look at the different conflicting notions of rhetorics. Now, you nicely mentioned about Nehru's tryst with destiny. If I look at, because I have a lot of interest in understanding rhetorics, politics and rhetorics, I have done some work on Nehruvian rhetorics. I mean, that is completely an exclusivist rhetorics. If you look at tryst to destiny, Nehru, you can say it's a completely an epideictic discourse, where it's sort of talking about policies, larger philosophies. How many people in India he could bring in within the fourfold of democratic citizenship? Very less. If you look at the rhetorics today, in 2014 and 2019 elections, probably you find that much more inclusivity in the larger body of politics. So what I'm trying to say that rhetorics can be extended to understand the sense of civility and the health of democracy as well. The way we look at societies, the kind of rhetorics which is playing. I just end here by saying there's a very interesting Tocqueville's statement. Democracy is just like an open box. Just even the lower portion is also totally open. So you keep on putting your statements and language, so nothing will be stored. So that's what I'm saying. Rhetoric is a very interesting area, because suddenly I find the rhetoric studies is a very, very important area, the way we look at elections, politics, and so on. Thank you for such a wonderful lecture.
Thank you.
Sir.
Thank you very much. And I think, your comment is well taken. And I think I look forward to your publication on partition. I'd really like to see those. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Das. Thank you, Professor Chaudhary. I will take up a few more questions, then we'll wind up this part. There is one question from Dr. Bikram Mahapatra. He says again, I'll take up all these questions together so that you can address them, ma'am. Dr. Bikram Mahapatra says, how to deal with oral history while reconstructing the history of partition days. I think that is what ma'am was the whole entire presentation is all about, but that is a question from him. I'll also get back to some more questions. There is one question from Chinmay Kumar Sahu. He says, do you think that the CAA Citizenship Amendment Act is needed in our country, basically for those who are displaced by different areas or from different places? This is one question from Chinmay Kumar Sahu in the chat box. Then there's a question by Prabhat Kumar Jana, who is asking, refugees create many crises in present Indian democracy. How will India solve this crisis during the pandemic COVID-19? Then there is one question from Jagdish G, and he's asking, what is the difference between refugees and migrants? Rather, he's asking, how do you historicize these two categories of refugees and migrants? These are some of the questions. If you can throw some light on them, ma'am. Very briefly, because they're very discreet and very open-ended questions.
Yes.
But then would like to address them.
Well, let me, address, I don't think I have all answers, but I think, the way we can look at the history of partition, that is, you're right, that I was trying to say that, this history has to be, you have to bring in the experience of people. And I think it is not just me, but a lot of partition scholars who have tried to, bring this back in. So this, I think, is very, very important. As for the other, question about refugee and migrant, I think, these two terms, refugee was a very specific term used at that point because, they came, but it was a very problematic term because most of them belong to undivided India, right? What you're doing is just bringing them from the place where they had an identity and a home and resettling them elsewhere. But you want them to embrace the category of refugee before the state can give them citizenship. And I think, I feel, connecting this to the question that is about CA, that we should have learned something of what happens when you, describe and categorize people this way. After so many years of independence, if you now start, doing this again, of course, it's going to create a huge amount of resentment, huge amount of violence. And we have seen enough violence. I think, we shouldn't, I really felt that we shouldn't go to that route. But I also think that if we look at migrants in India, we use that term very often for workers who work in another place. By that definition, I live in Bangalore. I am from Kolkata. So would I be seen as a migrant? Are we going to really cut ourselves off into little bits? No, all of us work together. That is the idea we have of India. And, it is not about really being confined in this way. So I think, I don't really know how we'll solve problems during the COVID pandemic. I think, COVID has really made us, look at some of these deeper issues because, I think we no longer are able to really physically go out and do things, though, you see certain sections, the doctors, the nurses working away. So I don't think I really have an answer how we'll solve it during COVID-19, but thank you. You are muted, I think. Professor Kar, you are muted.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for this brilliant presentation. I just wanted to tell our students, our participants in this webinar, ma'am has started this wonderful effort of having this Center for Public History. I wanted to just ask you, why have you named, what do you call by public history? I mean, would you kindly throw some light on this concept a little more? And then, since you are a great resource person for us, all of us who are students of history, political science, and humanities who are there in this webinar, we would need more and more interaction with you in terms of the kind of resources you deal with, which are very different from archival sources, and the notion of orality, how to make it more mainstreamed, and how to use the oral sources much more creatively, and look at them critically to have a different kind of history, or to enrich the discourse of history. Why do you call it public history? Would you kindly comment on this now?
Yes.
And we'll move on.
Thank you. I mean, public history is not new in Europe and the US and other parts, because for a long time they have been doing oral history and have been engaging with the public who have a very different idea of their past. And public history tries to take that into account. Public history also talks about this notion, which my co-editor Michael Frisch has given us, called the shared authority. Because public history doesn't give all authority to the historian. Public history says that there is a shared authority with the public who has an idea of where he or she is from. And I think oral history is one of its tools. That's what I teach. That in oral history, my interviewee is constantly correcting me, constantly telling me, you are not right. I have experienced it. Now, that is not something you experience in the archive when you have the authority to, sit and interpret all that. So this is a very interesting point that, how do you give them that space? My colleagues in Australia, Heather Goodall, for example, does a lot of interviewing with Aboriginal people. The books, she publishes two kinds of books because she's a public historian. So the first kind is a book she publishes in collaboration and with named author of the tribal, the Aboriginal person she has worked with. These are her books. And the other kind of book is the more academic book where she talks to them. In oral history too, we, unlike anthropology, we take it back and we ask, that this is how I'm interpreting a story. This is not usual. It is there in oral history. So you'll read a very famous, this for your students, a very famous essay by Catherine Borland called That's Not What I Said. And this is about the author's interview with her grandmother, and her grandmother saying, how have you written this? This is not what I told you. And this is, again, the problem with interpretation. So this is where, there is a process of far more democratic processes coming. Okay? So that is why, thank you.
Thank you so much for this brilliant presentation. Now let us move on to, I don't want to stand between you and Professor Das. I request Professor Das, Vishwajit Das to address us, and we'll have one other great session now. Sir is going to speak on Gandhian thought and communication. Over to Professor Das.
Thank you, Professor Kar. I must also congratulate the principal of the college to take such a wonderful initiative for this webinar series, and also the Bikram, who has been a kind of a major motivating force behind, organizing things. I'm very fortunate to have two distinguished panelists. One is Professor Indra Chaudhary, of course. We listened to her, such a brilliant insight and lecture. The other one, Jatinai, Professor Jatin Naik, who always happened to be as a mentor, as a mental signpost, growing up in Odisha and looking at some of the figures who were the benchmark in terms of the academic excellence. He was always there. So we could not much interact probably in Odisha, because we were scared of talking to him and looking at him. But outside Odisha, in fact, every conversation keeps you at ease and comfort, and also makes you convinced about what your struggle and the way you would like to look forward in life. So I'm very honored to be in this panel. I was asked to speak on Gandhian thought and communication, which is actually a recent book which came out from SAIS in 2021. I actually, I'm not a, let me make a confession that I'm not a Gandhian scholar. I'm not a Gandhian scholar, or I'm a scholar on Gandhi. I happen to, I teach intellectual history of communication. Very often I receive comments in the class from students about what is an Indian way of engaging with communication. I mean, conventional textbooks and lessons taught, or even the materials, are either based on North Atlantic or Eurocentric ideas. I mean, there is no Indian communication scholarship that sort of tries to indigenize communication of ideas, but there are no dearth of intellectuals whose contributions can be undermined that informs communication in India. I mean, intellectual history, as you know, that it's actually a study of intellectuals, ideas, and intellectual patterns over a time. It is also different from the history of ideas. I mean, for instance, communication is polysemic in meanings. I mean, it may be referred as circulation, exchange of ideas, articulation, transmission of ideas. I mean, each of these terms have a checkered history. And historian of ideas will tend to organize the historical narrative around one major idea and will then follow the whole development or metamorphosis of that idea as it manifests itself in different contexts and times. I mean, intellectual history, on the contrary, is often considered to be different from the history of ideas. I mean, it tends to regard ideas as historically conditioned features of the world, which are best understood within some larger context, whether it be the context of social struggle and institutional change, intellectual biography, or some larger context of cultural, linguistic dispositions, I mean, now often called discourse. I mean, hence studying intellectual history would help us to analyze and critique the narratives and Western theories that have constrained scholarship and initiated against the interrogation of ideas and their purpose within India in the field of communication. In fact, studying intellectual history compels scholars to take cognizance of a wider range of methods, texts, and actors that any established canon of Western political thought would permit. It examines how these ideas are received, reinterpreted by India's intelligentsia in the light of its own intellectual histories. I mean, information and ideas have traveled along a complex routes serviced by newsletters, runners, petition writers, and information specialists of various sorts in Indian society. I mean, the spread of the entire lithographic press and the rise of newspaper and book publishing intensified the dynamism of what you call the information dissemination in the subcontinent. It is from newspapers and ephemera rather than merely from the canonical texts, of thinkers that we can also reconstruct an Indian intellectual history of communication. Revisiting Gandhian writings is full of possibilities and promise in the realm of communication studies. I mean, where does one locate his contributions in terms of theory and method? Gandhi was not a theoretician. He did not consciously construct a blueprint, either theory or an ideal social order. He often said that his life was his message. This implies that Gandhi's ideas and ideals were not codified at one place in the form of a doctrine, but were diffused in the form of his activities. I mean, one has to extrapolate his ideas and ideology from an assemblage of his actions. Gandhi was no Marx, and he did not leave behind an explicitly worked out theory codified in a manifesto. I mean, there is certainly no Gandhian manifesto that we can use today to identify his theory and vision. Gandhi did leave behind many decades of political and social activities. Gandhi himself said that anyone wishing to follow him after he was dead and gone should simply look at what he did and how he did it rather than look for any well codified doctrine. I mean, conventional studies in social sciences and communications are premised on Western enlightenment and rationality. I mean, critiques contextualize Gandhian writings within a very narrow confines of modernity's celebration of scientific and technological progress in society. I mean, these assumptions were unacceptable for Gandhi. Gandhi, through his writings, made a trenchant critique of what you call enlightenment, premised on the philosophy of progress through instrumental modernity. Gandhi felt such a progress undermined and displaced cultural values and faith from its technologies of enquiry and constructed a new social order around market relations overseen by secular state. When we read Gandhi, we are moved by his texts, not just by his iconic texts such as Hind Swaraj or his autobiography, but by his numerous writings. I mean, correspondences and short letters. Gandhi was metaphorical. He knew how to use language. He was an experimenter with idiomatic vernacular expressions of language. Gandhi, as a communicator, was extremely transparent and straightforward. He spoke through multiple platforms. I mean, Gandhi was earnest enough to admit that what I say now is what applies. What I said earlier is not true anymore because I have done some thinking since then. This statement clearly reveals Gandhi as a thinking mind with a deeper purpose behind every act of communication. I mean, a communication perspective, however, also needs to embrace several facets, even in instances where Gandhi did not succeed as a communicator. I mean, there are also occasions where Gandhi's communication was successful because others around him made it possible. I mean, what is equally important is the perception. I mean, this perception refers to a kind of an aesthetic dimension that Gandhi was continuously referring to behind each of his communicative actions. I mean, this is especially true for the manner in which Gandhi selectively appropriated elements from Hindu mythology in a bid to communicate with the larger public sphere. Besides Gandhi's own act of communication, people organized Gandhi Katha, stories narrated about Gandhi in groups and gatherings that were part real and part derived from his body of work. Gandhi's communication is not only what he said, but also the reception, its interpretation, its reinterpretation, its creative interpretation, and its wrong interpretation. I mean, they together constitute a Gandhian perspective of communication. I mean, in Gandhian thought, the power of a symbol is not independent of the truth of the message. I mean, for Gandhi, the medium as the message works diametrically opposite to the manner in which it was enunciated by Marshall McLuhan. I mean, one of the leading media theorists, of course, he has been highly remained as a controversial because he was actually considered to be a blue-eyed boy of the US empires and the multinationals, and that is where he wrote a series of contributions he made, like Mechanical Bride, Gutenberg Galaxy, and the Global Village. I mean, it's just whole 70s and 80s. If you look at the international perceptions, McLuhan was everywhere. But McLuhan actually picked up all these ideas from Harold Innis, who was a very eminent labor historian, but the term labor history never existed when he was doing his research. He actually studied the entire linkage between US and Canada, and through the water, the fur trade, and in fact, The Bias of Empire is one of the classic work of Harold Innis. He was his colleague in Toronto, in University of Toronto. Marshall McLuhan is a man of literature, so he picked up those ideas, what Harold Innis did, and that's where, but Harold Innis provides a larger context of theorizing, understanding about communication and history. I mean, in Gandhian point of view, the message is not independent, and not every medium can carry every message. The medium is not neutral in the sense of truth and truthfulness. Critiques have not delved into the imagination, metaphor, and the use of symbolic and cultural resources that Gandhian writings and practice carry within. I mean, culture for Gandhi is an activity, a productive activity, something similar to labor, in Marx's own words, which produces and reproduces. I mean, if not commodities in that sense, but a way of life, a mode of life, which enables to critique, to create, recreate, realize, and therefore transform. I mean, culture for Gandhi is a set of symbols, experiences, signs grounded in the real world. Culture for him rests on the materialities of life. Gandhi used language not in a very strictly formal and instrumental sense, but for him, being a linguistic being, Gandhi engaged intensively with the language question throughout his life, not only with respect to English languages versus Indian languages, but with respect to what should be the language of a country like India. I mean, language for him was a vehicle of culture, of civilization. Civilization for him was not simply in terms of West and East civilization, but also a question of modernity. What Gandhi brings to bear in this very unusual little booklet in Hind Swaraj is to say that the very basis of value which modernity proposes sits on a hollow ground. In Gandhi's Hind Swaraj, the word Western civilization is used not in an ethnic sense, but to explain the modern West. It is a marker of what happened to Europe in its transformation to modernity, a transformation of a phenomenal and remarkable order. In fact, the success, the reach, and the depth of the transformation are such that not just the small continent called Europe sacked the world in terms of power, but the very modes of thinking, the very modes of formulation and language itself. The relationship of that language with the spoken language of ordinary life, the claims of the breech language, it's not just an arbiter of power and excellence, but about the very possibility of meaningful thought. In the past, it was possible to have classical languages with enormous reach and power, but they never, in any part of the world, could, with some exception, displace the natural vigor and resonance of the spoken vernaculars. The fundamental argument of Hind Swaraj is that the locus of value in modernity is shifted out of the human locus into the world of things. And therefore, the modern quest, which begins as a quest to make man as the measure of things, has become things as the measure of man. It has been reversed, and that is the paradox that Gandhi was addressing. And the word he uses for the way out of this is Swaraj, which is most interesting word, expression and concept. There are three elements of the word Swaraj. One, Swa, here refers to the individual self, the little life that is given to all of us, but with a profound sense of completeness, and the Swa of the collective, social, particular, a political otia, but this little Swa, in its littleness, rests on the infinity of an interior life that never be without transcending cosmic reference, from whence arise both the sense of loneliness and the quest to transcend, and the power to question our own principles, markers of identity, Even in the moment of most critical measure, Gandhian ideas cannot be grasped by applying fixed categories and traditional philosophical assumptions. Second, categories plucked out of literary theory do not convey an overall sense of what Gandhi actually stood for. I mean, his entire worldview has to be located in the proper historic context. Gandhi was a prolific writer and spoke always with a context and according to the demands of the situation. As he perceived them, Gandhi did not use the word modernity to address the realities of contemporary modern life. He was a great political strategist, and his dialectic is also strategic. He preferred the notion of modern civilization to analyze the harsh facts that colonial people were facing in India, while talking about a civilization. He focused on the negative aspects of modern civilization, and he often made it synonymous with Western civilization. Gandhi was convinced, while writing Hind Swaraj, that the chief driving force of Western societies is imperialistic, and its principal agenda for the colonized is to exploit the wealth and other resources from colonial lands for the benefit of the West. Gandhi's emphasis on the negative features of modern civilization has another concrete context. He was aware of the fact that many Indian expatriates in modern language were in a hypnotic grip of all-pervading, westernized wisdom that was not good for the welfare of humanity in general and India in particular. I mean, most of the expatriates were patriots in spirit, but their patriotism was limited and constrained due to their wrong political understanding. I mean, expatriate Indians were ideologues of individual heroic action that had the potential of inflicting violence. He found this ironically similar to the violent nature of the colonial state apparatus when it came to dealing with the lot of the subjugated people. There was yet another irony that bedeviled, in fact, the modernist worldview of the expatriate Indians. They hated British officials but loved the systems designed by them. They also did not understand the real nature of colonialism. Gandhi, during South African period, had realized and personally experienced many cases of imperialistic excesses. I mean, he also saw the real face of the proponents of modernity. Gandhi, through Hind Swaraj, tried to interrogate the hegemonic power of the colonial state over the minds of intellectuals and the subjugated masses. While explaining the issues of nationalism, Gandhi understood the necessity of ground political work and loaded through thoughtful intervention of early nationalists. He called Dadabhai Naoroji the father of Indian nationalism. He profoundly expressed in Hind Swaraj that religion is a personal matter, and in fact, there are as many religions as human minds in this world. I mean, religion cannot be the basis of nationalism of any kind. One should not try to mix the cultural notions of communalism or some other identity with nationalism just to undermine its very positive historical value. Gandhi was of the view that Indians should contribute to the overall knowledge of world civilization and the problems faced by the world in a manner that reflected their wisdom. I mean, at various points in time, he reaffirmed his faith in Hind Swaraj. I mean, there are three possible reasons behind it. First, Gandhi, during the course of the national movement, did develop an instrumentalist relationship with modern technology. He used it, but without really becoming a slave of it. He did see the total capacity of modern civilization to capture the minds and hearts of the people. Gandhi did not want to deprive himself and the movement and the people around him of the advantages of modern technology. Secondly, Gandhi's political life was actually a series of many failures and disappointments and frustrations. Chori Chora was one such disappointment. Rowlatt Satyagraha, holding firm to truth, was not very successful. The Bardoli education was not very successful. The peasants paid a huge price for it, and he wanted the Congress to do some spinning. He wanted to make spinning a compulsory part of Congress activities. Finding that there were not many takers, he eventually gave it up in 1922. Therefore, Hind Swaraj provided a kind of a psychological cushion for him in the face of failures and setbacks. The third reason is related to the nature of modernity itself. Although the economic, political, and social superiority of modernity is not in doubt, it was seen as a morally vacuous. The source of morality tend to dry up. A hectically mobile, egalitarian, instrumental society finds it generally hard to generate moral resources. In Gandhi's search of morality, Hind Swaraj became a mental signpost. For him, tradition was a huge reservoir of morality. Hind Swaraj served exactly that purpose. Gandhi's use of symbolic resources is phenomenal. He termed worker struggle as dharam-yudh. One may call it a religious struggle, but it was not a religious struggle in that sense, because dharma for Gandhi again was a very polysemic word, where language was employed in a non-traditionalist sense. Gandhi advised workers to remain firm in their commitment to strike. For him, satyagraha is a struggle where wresting the best wages possible is not the issue. It is important to hold one's honor and dignity. Gandhi told workers not to rely on finances from outside to survive during the course of the strike. They have to work, and work is very important. A few lessons to learn from this experience is Gandhi interpreted the strike as a moral struggle against injustice. He placed it in the context of a broader struggle, not only in India, but the world over, including in South Africa, where Gandhi had a first-hand experience of a successful dharam-yudh. Gandhi wanted the striking workers to act as satyagrahis who would be prepared to suffer for the achievement of justice. There should be no ill will against the mill owners. He told workers to earn their own livelihood by working in the period of the strike and not to depend on contributions from sympathizers. It's according to Gandhi in that sense, but it amounted to a dole and would end up in degrading workers in the eyes of the employees and the others. Gandhi sought to maintain a balance between the interests of both the parties so that none would claim victory, which would obviate lasting bitterness between them. His retrospective assessment of the strike was positive because it ultimately restored faith among the workers and taught them to remain steadfast in the face of adversity. There was a particular failure of communication, as the ideas which Gandhi wished to convey to the workers as well as to the mill owners were not fully carried through certain methods of communication employed by Gandhi. Was quite new. And although these newer channels widened his reach, they also created newer forms of misunderstanding. Moreover, the messages which he tried to convey and also had certain novelty so far as the conduct of the labor strike was concerned. The vivid mythological as well as secular imagery he invoked was not easy to grasp in the mundane and conflict-ridden world of labor relations. Finally, we can say that his conception of satyagrahis was quite new and idiosyncratic, and in a way it remained so until the end, at least for the majority of the people. Certain communication failure was inbuilt, and the polysemic nature of Gandhi's various concepts. It does not mean, however, that it was a total failure. I mean, given the challenges he faced in his political career, Gandhi was constantly looking for better and more effective methods of communication all the time. I mean, the open letter and the pamphlet were used by the early Congress leaders in their agitations. The pamphlets, for instance, was a very effective means of communication in those days and could really be dated back to Tom Paine's Rights of Man in the 1790s. And the pamphlet worked at several levels. It shorter was and was easier to read than a book or even perhaps a newspaper. I mean, in addition, it could be easily disseminated as it were cheap. I mean, in times of repression, a pamphlet and the very act of its possession itself became a symbol of defiance. I mean, this, for instance, is to be found in the case of something called the Green Pamphlet, I mean, which Gandhi brought with him from South Africa in 1896, and which listed the grievances faced by Indians in South Africa. I mean, owing to its green color, it came to be known as the Green Pamphlet. I mean, this pamphlet was sold out at his first meeting in India, and thereafter several editions were brought out. And the more the government tried to repress it, the more popular it became. I mean, Gandhi's brand of journalism is different. I mean, it may be at best be referred as an advocacy journalism, because today, when we talk about journalism in India, we do not do much more on journalism as in studies. Rather, we more talk about journalism as training. So whatever being taught in India, we have not much contributed to journalism studies. So now if we look at, today we live in a time where we're in an era of what we talk about fake news. So what I'm saying is Gandhi actually started this whole idea of advocacy journalism. That's another strand of journalism. Gandhi's brand of journalism is different. I mean, it may be best referred as a kind of an advocacy journalism. Gandhi highlighted about Hindu-Muslim amity, Indian independence, Indian indentured laborers in South Africa, and above all, about equality. He started this newspaper to depict the conditions of indentured laborers. I mean, the South African authorities did not make a distinction between a laborer and a professional. In 1903, Gandhi started his first newspaper, weekly in English and Gujarati, titled Indian Opinion, in Durban. By the autumn of 1903, he began covering the nation's indentured workers. In its first 11 years, India's Opinion would have almost 200 separate articles with the word indentured in the heading. In September, in fact, in 1903, it reminds me, the advocacy journalists described these laborers in this way. Let me remember the quotation. The indentured Indian is practically helpless. He comes from India in order to avoid starvation. Gandhi knew that writing about their plight is often would keep them in the public eye. He was setting the agenda in the South African press. When Gandhi took his movement to India, the indentured cause shifted to that of the untouchables, and equality stayed near the top of his journalistic agenda. Similarly, the open letter addressed to the authorities, which would begin by informing people about their latest problems and grievances. It served, in fact, two purposes. I mean, first, it addressed the authorities. Second, it educated people about various issues. Gandhi's Swadeshi exhibition in 1923, after the withdrawal of non-cooperation movement, illustrates the power of spinning and weaving. It also provided a unique platform to people from across the country to compete at applying charkha. I mean, the phenomenal success of Swadeshi exhibitions in 1923 was visited by almost 1 lakh of people, and thereafter it became a great crowd puller in the next coming years. As one of the scholars, it reminds Lisa Trivedi, says, this became a visual means of communication which transcended language. It also explains the centrality of the charkha to the concept of Swadesi itself. Gandhi used several such visual symbols to communicate and convey this philosophy. Even the burning of foreign clothes can be seen as yet another visual symbol. The Gandhian Khadi movement responded to the colonial challenge not merely at the level of economics and culture, but also providing alternatives to the colonial science and knowledge system at each and every level. I mean, one of the primary objectives of the Khadi movement was to revive household spinning and challenging the notion of inferiority of Indian cotton production. I mean, for this, the Khadi movement had to look at the alternative indigenous crops. I mean, the responses of the Khadi movement was not one of culture only, but very few a technological one too. I mean, talking about the essence of scientific method, Gandhi once remarked, let me remember the quotation. It's called, no science, yes, has dropped from the skies in the perfect form. I mean, all sciences develop and are built through experience. The spinning wheel was very soon appropriated as a symbol of loyalty and an image to reflect true nationalist spirit by Gandhian leaders. It was a symbol of identification for Congress leaders. Regional leaders often circulated their photographs depicting quite prominently the charkha, Gandhian cap, and Khadi dress. The Khadi campaign sought to divide Indians into two classes. I mean, those who believed in it and wore Khadi, and those who did not. However, Gandhi's class division was enforced non-violently, though it was not entirely free of coercion. It provided a mobility, a passage from one class to another. His emphasis on non-violence was intended to provide a possibility for the transformation of an individual's political engagement. I mean, wearing Khadi in that sense was a transformative experience. I mean, one could change one's class affiliation through personal conviction and a change of the heart. I mean, Khadi became an ideological symbol on which one's political and personal beliefs could be vindicated. One's clothing became an index of one's political affiliations. Recognition of the choice regarding clothes did not arise as an actual outcome of Khadi. The dilemma of choosing Khadi or other clothes was enforced through a sustained campaign. I mean, Khadi's core semiotics lay in it being presented as a commodity of colonial resistance. I mean, in sort of refurbishing charkha, there was the use of tradition, but the new reinvented charkha was put in the service as a modern carrier of import substitution. Khadi gradually transformed itself into a political fabric. A wearer of Khadi became, in the eyes of authority, a rebel. Khadi's transformation from clothing to a political uniform gave the cloth a character. It became a commodity of conscious choice. The ideological investment in Khadi enhanced the character of the cloth. I mean, I would just like to sum up here by saying that in my presentation, with some of the core issues of communication that may be discerned from Gandhian writings and contributions so as to develop a starting point for my any creative engagement with Indian communication. It also deals with the question of knowledge, practice, and strategies of communication, and also finally a relevance of Gandhian communication in the present era. I mean, any discussions on the knowledge of communication in Indian society needs to address these key attributes that contributes to the formation of communication and the constitution of Indian society. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir, Professor Das, for this stimulating lecture. It was indeed very, very stimulating and impactful. You covered a huge canvas in this 35-40 minutes, and there are some questions in the chat box. I'll come to you before, but I would say that Gandhi was an excellent communicator. Was he an excellent communicator? Did he communicate all his ideas when he says You said that he says that my life is my message, and could Indians really understand him? Because at the end of the day, we find Gandhi terribly failed. Though he transformed lives, he influenced almost all aspects of Indian life. He became a new age guru, in the sense that he brought so many fundamental changes, and at least tried to initiate those changes, whether it was caste question, or the Adivasi question, or the question of Dalits, or the question of gender. Almost every aspect of Indian life were touched by his philosophy, and he got engaged continuously in changing Indian society, and at the same time keeping people united under one political umbrella to fight the colonial government and all that. And when you talked about khadi as a powerful symbol, Gandhi was metaphorical. Khadi was turned into a political uniform, and his Hind Swaraj was a trenchant critique of modernity. And then the way he creatively used tradition in critiquing the colonial government and bringing about inner transformation, we wonderfully conceptualized and very coherently managed to tie these different dimensions of Gandhian thought into a wonderful lecture and presentation. Now there are some questions, there are a few questions, sir, which I would put to you.
Yeah, please.
There is one question from Sri Alek Gadai. He's asking, what is the relevance of Gandhian ideology in this era of globalization? Sir, you can take these questions together. Some of these, there are very few. The second is, there is one question by Dr. Vikram Mahapatra. He says that your views, how do you see that the Khilafat movement of Gandhi was a communication failure? Do you agree or do you disagree? How do you respond to that? And I have a small question tagged with this too. That two things I need to ask Mr. Das. One is, Gandhi always talked about non-violence and satyagraha. The two terms have been very profusely used in his life and his writings and by Gandhian scholars, and there is a problem of understanding what Gandhi really meant by non-violence, and what was the satyagraha, the unique political weapon or a methodology or a strategy he devised for all Indians to fight the British. And in fact, satyagraha was not a political weapon only; it was a way of life for Gandhi, if I understand it correctly. So why did Gandhi, or how did Gandhi, or how far was he successful in communicating to the common man the idea of non-violence? What he exactly meant by non-violence, how to attain this state of being, how to really have a personal freedom struggle, or let me, if I use that word, how to really devise a personal satyagraha to fight one's fears, to fight one's limitations, to fight one's dilemmas, to fight one's psychological crisis, and to rise above personal selfish agendas, and to serve the country and think of collective welfare and all that. And the other question, last question I would ask is, when you talk about communication and all that, Gandhi also was very critical of English as a language of communication, or he says in one of his in one of his critiques of the colonial education policy, that it is the English language which destroyed the rising cultural common sense of Indians. And we need to emphasize on the Matrabhasha, the mother tongue, or regional languages to stay rooted and to understand and to carry on this education in a more holistic fashion. So what is this critique of Gandhian critique of English as a destroyer of cultural common sense, or destroyer of our cultural creativity, which made Indians, I mean, it made Indians. This was harm than good as far as continuing education is concerned. I don't know. This is listed in Dharampal's that critique of a beautiful tree, that critique of Indian colonial education system. Would you kindly address this question, sir?
Anyway, thank you, Professor Kar, for such series of a volley of questions.
Sir, you can answer some of them. You can deal it mine. You can answer some of them. And
I'm really amazed. You see, let me put it this way.
Sir.
You see, there are more damage done to Gandhi by his Gandhians. That you need to understand it. I mean, you need to engage with Gandhi from a scholarship. There are Gandhi basers and there are Gandhi supporters. So the whole Western modernity itself has completely made Gandhi completely dismissed. Now you think about today, you live in Indian society, anything happens, who is there? Who is there? Name me a single figure whom you would refer. Anything comes, obviously you have nobody else except Gandhi. That's number one. Whatever Gandhi said, you need to understand the context. Whatever you can't just apply Gandhi everywhere. Gandhi is not a acid test litmus paper who can be tested everywhere. What Gandhi says, it's not like simply when people say in journalism, all rubbish. They need to understand the context when Gandhi wrote, and the way Gandhi did it in South Africa is remarkable. I mean, probably he is talking about a press which never existed at all. He never, you see, he critiqued the whole modernity, the context of Western modernity when he critiqued. He also critiqued the institutions of modernity. Press, of course, being a part of the Western modernity. Now, English press, when you are talking about it, he is critical about it. Now, but he wanted to do journalism. Journalism is much beyond press. I mean, journalism has nothing to be confined into the four walls of the press. He wanted to convey his ideas. He did it successfully. He did it in Africa, in South Africa. He did it, and I mean, that was a kind of an advocacy, a kind of a journalism which he is talking about. In India, when you talk about press never existed like that. Press never existed. It was a kind of it's a mediated between the state and the civil society. Press, this is how press functions in India. It's very clear. So that you can only see when a leader sneezes or catches cold, that will be the news in your newspaper. It's not about what Gandhi has been writing, in South Africa. So it's a larger discourse, larger debate. Let's not get into that. Now, what I'm saying is, Gandhi said a lot of things, a lot of issues he raised. I mean, we need to now, suddenly you are extending to sustainability, ecology, Gandhi's notion of peace, non-violence. Probably we have too much. I mean, there are the whole 50s, 60s, you find scholarship, they went on dismissing Gandhi forever. I mean, this is where, I mean, I can't go to the contributions, immense contributions. I mean, they critique because they looked at within a very confined lens of modernity. And Gandhi critiqued that Western modernity. Gandhi critiqued. Automatically, he says that if you follow it, it will be a failure. And that's what it means. He dismisses the entire. So you need to understand that what Gandhi dismissing, because we are not conceptually grounded. That's what Gandhi's contributions are, because nowadays it's a fashion, the Gandhi Munna Bhai, Gandhi globalization. It's all nonsense. You need to understand your question. The art of asking question is most important, because when you are talking about Gandhi, you need to also understand that how you frame a question. I mean, I can't take loosely Gandhi for each and everything, how Gandhi does it, how Gandhi fits my home, how Gandhi drives. I mean, you need to understand how you frame a question, which is most important, because Gandhi said about certain ideas. You need to test those ideas. Gandhi never discussed at all about the way things are happening. Gandhi never. I said that Gandhi, even he is learning from his own failure of his own interventions, whether you talk about now Satyagraha. That's a very interesting term I would like to say. There are two distinctions which you have to make between Satyagraha and Duragraha. Now, whenever Gandhi did Satyagraha, he did, against or within his own community. Gandhi is doing Satyagraha within his own community. And Duragraha, when he's again actually fighting outside. He's fighting outside. So we need to be very clear when we talk about Satyagraha and Duragraha. See, these are two distinctions. Satyagraha is within. So I would go and make a fasting. I will torture my body. In fact, I know about what Bhikkhu Parekh talks about. Non-violence is another form of violence. You see, this is where you play with the gimmicks. I mean, there are agreements and disagreements. Let's not talk about Gandhi, the whole book on Bhikkhu Parekh's writings or Parel's writings. I'm quite informed about all these literature. But still then I would like to place Gandhi that, look, there are intellectuals, whether it is Tagore or Gandhi. You see, you need to understand these are intellectuals, and from them we would like to decipher ideas and how we connect to our society. Otherwise, what is there? Fundamentals, there is nothing. I mean, so this is what I do, because my students always ask that what is the way to indigenize understanding about communication? We have nobody to follow up. Probably today people are talking about Ambedkar. That is also very controversial, because now people also talk about Phule. I mean, Phule was much, he was the pioneer rather than Ambedkar. So now there are a lot of controversies and other things. But I'm saying that this is what we need to engage. We can't just look at from a Western lens and critique it, because most of the literature and the writings which you read and we dismiss. So we need to understand and ground it, because this is again a kind of as we understand in Indology, because the earlier morning speech was brilliant, whereas he was talking about oral history. Because, in anthropology, in any scholarship in anthropology, the whole Orientalism or the Indological readings of text itself, it's a kind of the Western spectacles, and you are wearing their spectacle to see your own society. So that's what you need to understand. You need to demystify reading literature, deconstruct it, and try to see things. I can't just give a loose statement. So I'm quite informed about it. So, but what I'm saying is, you need to critically engage. I mean, of course, Gandhi, we all know today probably, this will be too, today, if you look at, when you say globalization, that globalization, the entire global bubble has collapsed. Now, where you are leaving? Where you are leaving? What globalization are you referring today? It's a total look at pandemic has collapsed. Pandemic is a global byproduct. Let me tell you, pandemic is a global byproduct. And that has come nicely to us. So there are more risks. We live in a more risk society anyway. So what I'm trying to say that Gandhi tried to critique that if you do this, this will happen. So he critiqued it in his own way. So we need to engage with his ideas and look forward that how can we take it further. I think I will stop here because there is more. Yes.
We need to think very critically about Gandhi and take it forward. Now we would go and listen to another stimulating lecture. We have with us Professor Jatin Naik, one of the brilliant teachers in this state, has produced such a erudite person, our mentor. And, the Professor Naik doesn't need any introduction in Odisha, and such a great resource person and student-friendly person he is. It will be a wonderful experience to hear Professor Naik. And as a patron of Shiksha Sandhan, as Rupantar, and his continuous writings are so stimulating, and they're having a great impact on the reading community in the state and outside. And Payal has already talked about his thing. I would invite Professor Jatin Naik to address us, and I know we are late and we'll continue. And it will be a wonderful, it's a privilege and honor to hear Professor Naik this morning. Professor Naik, please. Sir, would you kindly unmute yourself, sir? Sir,
okay.
Kindly unmute, sir.
Am I audible now?
Yes, sir. You're clearly audible, sir. Audible and
Okay.
visible, sir.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Kara. And I'm delighted to be here today, and I'm very happy that two of my dearest friends have already made erudite and insightful presentations. So what I will focus on will be very uninteresting, but I think has great urgency. So I hope you'll bear with me, and I thank the principal of Jawaharlal College for giving me this opportunity. So I'll be very brief. I'll try to be as brief as possible, because I shouldn't try the patience of the listeners. I think Dr. Kara gave me the starting point when he talked about Gandhi's denunciation of English as a medium of education or medium of instruction. So today I would like to focus on building a knowledge society, and my area of my focus would be on Odisha, although it will have some national references. So I would first begin by saying that even during colonialism, we are talking about a kind of knowledge society. Macaulay, when he dismisses all the knowledge produced in Sanskrit and Arabic and thought that we should only be educated through English, he's talking of a particular kind of knowledge society. And the kind of knowledge society that existed before colonialism came is also a knowledge society in which there is a severe monopoly of knowledge. Not many people had access to knowledge. So when colonialism came, they introduced another kind of restriction, that it has to be, knowledge has to be accessed through English, not Sanskrit, not Arabic, and certainly not the regional languages. So colonial, anti-colonial struggle, the agenda of anti-colonial struggle also has a cultural dimension. We always focus on the political dimension, but it has a cultural dimension in the sense how to confront the devaluation of Indian culture. So there are many ways of doing it. In fiction, in Bankim Chandra's fiction, in Fakir Mohan Senapati's novels, in many creative writers, we find an attempt to write anti-colonial allegories. But I'm not talking about that. I confine myself to the building of a knowledge society. And again, like Biswajit said, wherever we go, we meet Gandhi. So Gandhi is, in fact, when he came to Odisha in 1921, somebody asked him, you received education through the medium of English. Now you ask us not to do so. You ask us to receive instruction through our own regional languages or mother tongue. So Gandhi gave a very interesting answer to that question, which made him very controversial, and Tagore was very unhappy with him. He said, I would have been a much bigger, greater human being had I received my instruction not through English. He gave the example of Nanak, he gave the example of Chaitanya, he gave the example of Shankaracharya. He said, were these people educated through English? This is a very unconventional way of answering, not a very satisfactory, but there is something interesting here. And Gandhi consistently talked about making Indian languages, not just Sanskrit, not even Hindi, modern day Hindi. He's talking about all Indian languages to become languages of knowledge. Because one important thing that the colonizers did was to destroy our confidence in our own languages as languages capable of expressing thought. They're very good as languages of entertainment. You can write novels in them, but you can't write about psychology, sociology, or physics in our languages. So Gandhi was very, very emphatic that Indian languages, in order to resist the cultural onslaught of colonialism, emerged as languages of knowledge. And around this time, around 1911, Nagendranath Basu Bengal writes the encyclopedia, Biswakos. And when Gandhi arrived in India, he visited him, because encyclopedia writing now became extremely popular, because every Indian language, after the anti-colonial struggle took off, started engaging in writing encyclopedias, because they all wanted knowledge to be communicated through or conveyed through their own languages. English as a linked language, fine, but the link shouldn't replace the chain. That's perhaps what Gandhi had in mind, or many people, even Gopabandhu Das in Odisha, constantly talked about the kind of energy that we are wasting on just learning English. Just mastering English is wasting, dissipating all our energies. We have very little time for anything else. So even before Gandhi, there was this critique of English as a medium of instruction, that knowledge of English should never be mistaken for knowledge. So if you want to build a knowledge society, if you want to look beyond colonial constructs of knowledge, you must promote and strengthen your own languages. That's why I think, if now I'll come to the post-independence, this legacy had to be carried forward, because this was a strand of anti-colonial struggle. English was introduced by Macaulay, who wanted a class of interpreters. He didn't want knowledgeable people. He wanted a class of interpreters between the rulers and the ruled, So he wanted a class of clerks or people who knew English so that they could interpret what the masters think to the people who are ruled. Then, of course, English was introduced, became extremely popular, and in spite of, contrary to Macaulay's intentions, it produced many great thinkers. We acquired a great command of English, produced great writers, great orators, great thinkers. But at the same time, in all states, and all provinces, everyone, all thinking freedom fighters tried to promote and strengthen regional languages. That was the time when I think great magazines were published, new literary forms were introduced, essay as a literary form was introduced so that it could become a vehicle of conveying knowledge to people. So after independence, this legacy has a highly complicated history. If you go to 1948, I think when Radhakrishnan commission was hired, it was a higher education commission. Strangely, Dr. Kara referred to Dharampal and all that. Primary education was never focused upon by the government of independent India. It was left to the states. So the first education commission was a higher education commission presided over by, chaired by Radhakrishnan. So a real education commission in the true sense of the term, I think was set up in 1964 under the chairmanship of Dr. D.S. Chaudhary. And then he had as his secretary, one of the greatest educational thinkers of India, J.P. Nayak. And this submitted its report in 1966. And there is I will talk about this report, some of the central features of this report, and how even today we are grappling with its complicated legacy. So what did this report do? This report suggested that higher education should be imparted through the medium of mother tongues or regional languages, but English won't be abandoned. So this was accepted by the Parliament in 1968, and the Parliament started extending funds to the governments of the various states. There are 14 languages at that time, so 14 languages and English, and in all states, textbook bureaus were set up. And all these textbook bureaus in the 1970s started translating texts from English or writing textbooks in regional languages. In Odisha, by 1981, there are 300 such textbooks translated on physics, on psychology, on sociology, on education, on literature and literary theory, and everything. More than 300 texts were published. And these were written by or translated by very eminent educationists. And in the forewords written by the director of the textbook bureau, there are several directors between 1970s and 1992, and I looked at all the forewords, and there are some very interesting observations they make, and they express the hope of a newly independent India to do something that colonizers had not done, to strengthen or to promote, to elevate Indian languages as languages of knowledge. They were languages of entertainment. They are languages of creative writing, but their status as languages of knowledge through which modern knowledge can be conveyed or communicated through Indians was very uncertain, was not very high indeed. So I will just summarize some of the observations with these directors and the fond hopes they expressed, that what reading or getting educated through the medium of one's mother tongue or through regional languages will do. And they will appear very strange now because times have changed. The globalization to which one of the students referred to, all these have changed the cultural landscape radically. And the fond hopes that these directors expressed and the fond hopes that Chaudhary Commission report had embodied will now look very outdated and highly complicated, but their urgency hasn't disappeared. So I'll just mention some of the hopes they expressed. One is that they did that between 1970s and 1990. That introduction, that this knowledge will they were confident that knowledge will now be available in regional languages. Number one, all the knowledge of the world will now be available through the Indian regional languages and the mother tongues of students. And education received through the medium of regional languages will break the barrier dividing the English-speaking elite and the ordinary people of the country. That is another fond hope. Let's see whether that hope was justified or not. The other hope that was expressed related to the idea that mother tongue will serve to promote nationalism, secularism, and a scientific outlook. All of them were deeply confident that education imparted through the mother tongue or through regional languages will promote nationalism, a deep love of your land and your language, secularism, and a scientific outlook. It will put an end to rote learning and unleash creativity in students. So in all these 4 words written by different directors, these hopes were voiced, articulated, that learning or acquiring knowledge through a regional language or your mother tongue will promote a deep love for your land, will foster a scientific outlook, and will put an end to rote learning and unleash creativity in students. So more than 300 texts, I don't have the figures relating to other states, but at least in Odisha, more than 300 textbooks were produced by in regional languages or written in regional languages, or in many cases, famous textbooks prescribed in Western universities were translated into Odia, and they were circulated. And students, some of them, these actually went through 2-3 editions, but many of them never saw a second edition. So what went wrong? This grand project of creating a knowledge society through imparting instruction in mother tongue, regional languages, where did this project go wrong? Because today, the situation has been completely reversed. English is, for instance, recently I came across an article by Kanti Chidambaram in response to the new education policy, the national education policy, which recommends teaching primary school children through their mother tongue. The Kanti Chidambaram says that English is an Indian language. And in Andhra Pradesh, in primary schools, the medium of instruction is now English. The High Court has struck it down, but now the case is in the Supreme Court. But the Chief Minister of Andhra Pradesh says that, well, all the even poor children, parents of poor children want their children to be taught through English. So what led to this situation? All over the country now, regional languages, mother tongue education is taking a backseat, is on the retreat. And ironically, around the same time, all the South Indian languages have been granted status of classical languages, and Odia has become one of the most vulnerable languages now, has also been granted the classical status. In South India, for instance, whenever Hindi is imposed, they don't talk about their own languages. They promote English. Tamil is not promoted. Kannada is not promoted. Telugu is not promoted. So English is emerging as the preferred language of knowledge in a country where we have so many languages, many of which are older than English. So what explains this? Where we stand now, nearly 40 years after, or 50 years after Chaudhary Commission expressed those lofty hopes, and the language question continues to be a very fruitful question, continues to oppress us, and the solution is nowhere visible, and English has become the default language of knowledge. So why did this happen? So I would suggest 2 or 3 answers to this. These may not be absolutely acceptable, but this is something that crosses my mind, so I'll share it with the students and my friends. In the context of Odisha, for instance, when these texts were prepared in the mother tongue or in the regional language, they appeared more difficult than the original texts because no attempt was made to make them pedagogically acceptable. They were simply translated, someone reviewed them, and then they were imposed on students. And they proved far more complex, far more difficult to understand than texts written in English. The other thing is our school education, which was bilingual. In the secondary schools, in primary schools, in high schools, the bilingualism was destroyed. School education is in a pathetic state. There, people acquired a good knowledge of English and good knowledge of the regional language, and when they came to college, they were absolutely equipped to understand lessons taught to them in English. But then school education is in a mess, and students' knowledge of both their regional languages or mother tongues and English are extremely poor. That leads to the emergence of, that encourages the rise of English medium schools, even in remote villages where the English taught there is even worse than Odia. So the third reason why regional languages fail to emerge as languages of knowledge is that they were no longer seen as languages of opportunity. We have newspapers which have fast circulation. People read newspapers in Telugu, Malayalam, Odia, and all that, but jobs are not available in these languages. So these are not languages of opportunity, or at least seen to be languages of opportunity. So once a language ceases to be seen as a language of opportunity, people will abandon it no matter how emotionally, how deeply they're connected to it. So, and the government policies. On the one hand, the government says that, well, most of the linguistic states, they can take care of their own languages and all that. But government policies have been systematically inimical to the emergence of Indian languages as languages of knowledge. And when these languages fail to emerge as languages of knowledge, English automatically, as a default language of knowledge, dominates the cultural landscape. But is it something that is desirable? Is it something that we should accept, that the link language should now replace the chain? Can any country, is it true of all the countries in the world? For instance, India, once TK women, Biswajit would substantiate this, described India not as a nation, but not as a nation state, but as a national state, something like the European Union. In spite of the dominance of English in Europe, no country has abandoned its mother tongue. And many countries like in China, Japan, they haven't abandoned their mother tongue, although they learn English with great energy and enthusiasm. So this either-or situation is peculiar in India because we have used the diversity argument against our own languages. Just because India is a diverse nation, just because India is characterized by amazing diversity, linguistic, cultural, and so we say that, well, in order to cope with this diversity, we need a language which has nothing to do with our languages, which is, now we say it's an Indian language, but for all practical purposes, it's an elite language. It's a language of the colonizer, a language still not fully understood by millions. So diversity has been very cleverly used against itself, that diversity justifies the destruction of diversity. So this is a very important question that we have to deal with. And knowledge, if all these languages disappear as languages of knowledge, they will become spoken languages. And once they're spoken languages, a vacuum will be created, which will be filled with violence, because each language presents a worldview, embodies a worldview. Each language, for instance, my friend Indra cannot do much by way of collecting oral history if everybody speaks English after 10 years, 15 years. So language is vitally interlinked with memory. And once memory is erased, a language becomes a language of mere entertainment, a language loses its status as a language of knowledge, then memory is eroded and a kind of collective amnesia, collective Alzheimer's disease will overtake us. and it will this will be nothing short of a disaster. So I revisited the Chaudhary Commission report, its recommendations, its fond hopes, and I said how a knowledge society which will exclude Macaulay's report excluded millions of Indians. Then independence, our emphasis on English again excluded millions of Indians. You can't have a knowledge society in which the language, which is actually the resonant vernacular which Vishwajit referred to, emotionally rich and resonant vernacular, they die, and a language which came as a linked language has replaced the chain. I think the scenario, the prospect is a bleak and terrifying one. Without abandoning English, we should now strive to make efforts. We should make vigorous efforts to transform our moribund regional languages into languages of knowledge so that they can contribute to the national fabric. Thank you very much. I would take a few questions if these arise in the minds of the listeners. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I don't think I said anything very significant, but I did my best. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Nayak. The argument and the suggestions and revisiting Chaudhary Commission report, which was very essential as a milestone of educational development in this country, was analyzed thoroughly and very beautifully argued. All that you said was, should be again critically thought about. A few points. Let me quickly summarize what Professor Nayak said. That the recommendations which the Chaudhary Commission said about knowledge will be available in Indian regional languages, and to break the barrier between English speaking people and ordinary people is very important. We need to promote nationalism, secularism, and scientific temper among the common people, and then we need to put an end to rote learning and then encourage creative learning. And in the process, what has gone wrong with this great project? Professor Nayak suggested very important points. One, that the problem was because the Odia texts which were produced in 1970s and 90s, 300 of them, they became very difficult to understand vis-a-vis their English counterparts. So that was a very huge problem. And we need to address that issue, how to create new text in Odia so that which is intelligible and understandable by easily comprehensible by all people, and more democratic, more accessible. And that is one thing he raised. He talked about how the bilingualism was destroyed in our educational institutions and how to again create conditions for restoration of this bilingualism without saying goodbye to English. He also talked about encouraging the trend of English medium schools and their onslaught on our regional languages is a issue which you need to grapple with. Then he talked about how regional languages have failed to become a language of knowledge and language of opportunity, and therefore how Odia or other languages which have got even South Indian languages which have got classical status, but they are under the mercy of English. And the diversity argument he was talking about, how in the name of diversity, the importance given to English as a linked language, how it has broken the chain and how it is destroying diversity, and how these regional languages will remain as spoken languages. Wonderfully articulated, sir. Thank you so much. And there are a few questions. I will get back to them. There are few questions or asked. Let me see the chat box. There is one question from Dr. Bikram Keshwari Jena. He's asking, in post-colonial society, what is important? Ideas, information, or knowledge? And then he says that in the national movement, if you see communication and communication, the way communication was taken forward, what are you saying? But nowadays, okay, then he's basically asking about how in post-colonial society we should reconfigure our ideas about or our strategy about vernacular or reinventing or empowering our vernacular languages. And then there is one question by LB Oza. He's asking, is it the only way to make our language? What is he asking? I'm not getting this question. Is it possible? Actually, he's asking. I think this is my way of interpreting this question. Is it really possible to make the regional language as a language of knowledge and opportunity? If yes, how? I think these are the questions you can take up.
I think, thank you for these searching questions, and I may not be able to answer them to your satisfaction, but I'll try. I think to Bikram's question, I would answer saying that you can't think of ideas and information without language, because these are communicated through language. So depending on which language you receive them from, the agenda is decided. If you are learning, getting all your knowledge only through English, then of course you are neglecting or ignoring, losing sight of many other areas of experience which are available in other languages. So I think we shouldn't think of ideas and information by divorcing them from the language through which they're communicated. So we should understand the importance of language. And I didn't mean that. I think one of you asked the question that should we abolish English? This either or argument is a very, very dangerous argument. Gandhi, for instance, wrote in Gujarati, wrote in Hindi, knew Latin, wrote wonderful in English, and perhaps knew a little Afrikaans. And most of our great leaders, all of them were bilingual or trilingual. So why are we becoming dangerously, depressingly monolingual? So this is extremely, and think of, for instance, Fakir Mohan Senapati. Knew Bangla, knew Odia, knew Bengali, and Hindi, and knew Telugu, and learned a little Persian. So earlier in the past, there was also some Persian language. That didn't lead us to abolish or abandon our own language. Why English should force us? In which we communicate to each other emotionally. So this either or situation.
Sir, your voice is breaking. Professor Naik, sir, your voice is breaking. Sir, you are audible not clearly, sir. I would request all other participants except the speaker to mute their video audio so that I think sir can be audible clearly. Sir, please carry on, sir. Please carry on, sir.
Okay. Said that well and think of ideas or concepts with language. Language is very important for all of us. Is that in terms of either or, that in all languages, regional languages and English, 2-3 regional languages and English. That was what happened in the past. All our great leaders were multilingual, or at least trilingual. So, depressingly monolingual, which will intellectually and culturally and emotionally impoverish. So, all engaged in the profession of teaching or profession of an intellectual profession should go back to elevating his own language as a language of knowledge. Read everything in English, write in English, also write about those ideas in their own language as lucidly as possible, so that the language grows as a language of knowledge. I hope I was audible.
Yes, sir, you are audible and very rightly said. Sir, to go back to Professor Das and Professor Chaudhary has a few questions. Would you answer them and then we'll wind up? We have been here for last more than 2.5 hours. So Professor Das is asking.
Yes.
Professor Das is asking, Jatin Bhai, need little more clarification about how diversity creates destruction of diversities. Sounds very promising. Take forward. Okay, sir. So please.
Yeah. I think whenever the question of promoting English at the expense of regional languages is mooted, we always talk about, we blame India's diversity. For instance, people say in China, Chinese is so powerful as a language because in China there is very little linguistic diversity. So we use Indian diversity as an argument against the promotion of Indian regional languages. Whereas throughout history, regional languages negotiated with each other, linked themselves to each other, interacted with each other, and created a rich cultural mosaic and fabric. So using this diversity against diversity, diversity is a good thing in biology, in culture, but when it comes to language, our elite, members of our elite immediately say, well, we can deal with this amazing diversity, English is the answer, or Hindi. Then immediately South Indians say no Hindi, but English. In the game, English wins and all the regional languages suffer. So we have to think beyond this, that shouldn't use diversity cleverly against diversity. Diversity is a good thing, great thing. India's greatness derives from its diversity, but we shouldn't use it to destroy regional languages as languages of knowledge. That's what I
Thank you so much, sir. We have the last question from Professor Indra Chaudhary. She wanted to ask something. Ma'am, please go ahead.
Thank you, Jatin. That was really very, very brilliant. I enjoyed it very much. One clarification I'd say that in Bangalore, we did have the Hindi Beda movement. Hindi Beda was, we don't want Hindi. We will not use Hindi as a signpost in the metro. The metro has two languages. It has Kannada. It'll make its announcement in Kannada, and it'll make it in English for all those who don't understand Kannada. But we don't need another language like Hindi. That was the thing. It's not really English winning, because I understand some Kannada. I don't speak it, but Kannada is very much the language here. But that is just a small point. Okay. I wanted to, actually tell you what you referred to, that, oral histories are not possible if we destroy linguistic diversity. And I was put in mind not so much of my own work, though in my own work, I have interviewed somebody who spoke Kui, which only has 22 speakers, but she finally said, okay, I'll speak Adivasi Odia because that is the language the rest of the people around me understood. I'm reminded of the work done by Anvita Anbi in Andaman, where, what was interesting is she started talking to somebody about their language, and he remembers, he only knows Hindi. That's the influence of the mainland. Now, when she started reminding him of stories and words, he came to her guest house middle of the night one day. So she thought something has happened. He said, Didi, I've remembered. I will tell you a story. I remember the language. So you see, just that one word or two words and stories associated with them brought back the language he knew as a child. And I think, this, I think, is something that we should teach our students to do, to try and collect stories in the languages that, those might be dialects of Oriya or Bangla or wherever people are, to collect those, because it'll keep those things alive. So I wanted to thank you for this wonderful, presentation and for telling us what happens.
I'll start saying that regional languages should also become hospitable to other regional languages. And regional languages have to be rescued from themselves. Sometimes we are so chauvinistic that we are more hostile to our own neighbor than to a foreign language. So I think Odia has to be rescued from Odias, Kannada has to be rescued from Kannadigas, Hindi has to be rescued from Hindi people. So I think that's on that note I would conclude. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you so much, sir. Beautifully concluded. I will not waste time. I must take this opportunity. I'll invite Sri Shubham Das to offer a formal vote of thanks. But before I quit, let me thank the authorities, organizers of Kuampal Jawaharlal Nehru College and Director K, Dr. Jena, and all the other organizers for giving this wonderful platform for great intellectuals like Professor Chaudhary, Professor Das, Professor Naik to deliberate upon us so patiently. Giving all that, giving such wonderful talks to us through webinar. It is a great opportunity. It's the brighter side of COVID-19. And I thank profusely Professor Indra Chaudhary for a brilliant presentation, Professor Das, Professor Naik for this wonderful presentations to us. Thank you so much. I request Shubham Das kindly to offer a formal vote of thanks.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon to all. It's an honor for me to extend a formal vote of thanks for this session that has completed its 15th round of panel discussion. First of all, I would like to thank our esteemed guest, Professor Indra Chaudhary, Professor Biswajit Das, and Professor Chatindra Kumar Naik for their insightful deliberation in this session. And special thanks to Professor Priyadarshi Kara sir for moderating this session. I extend my hearty thanks to Dr. Vikram Kesari Jena, Director of CAD, Odisha, and Chinmay Sahu, Executive Director of CAD, for their friendly cooperation to organize this webinar. I would also like to express my profound gratitude to our Principal Professor Pallav Chakrabarti for his hearty cooperation in organizing this webinar. I would also like to thank our convener, Professor Sarath Chandra Pradhan, coordinator Mr. Rudra Narayan Das, co-coordinator Ms. Payal Agrawal, and Baidhar Das for their support and guidance to organize this event. Finally, I would like to extend my heartfelt thanks to all the participants, academicians, students, intellectuals for sparing their valuable time with us and becoming a part of this intellectual discussion. Thank you, everyone. The meeting is concluded now. Our second session will be started at 4 p.m. Please stay connected to our WhatsApp group.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, madam.